My husband kept asking who stopped by the house while he was at work, but the weird part is he already seemed to know when someone had parked outside. So how exactly did he know that?
By the time my husband got home that Thursday night, I already had the pasta boiling and the local news playing quietly in the background. Nothing felt unusual at first. Corvin dropped his keys into the bowl by the door, kissed my forehead, and asked how my day working from home had been. We'd been married 6 years, living in the same quiet neighborhood where everyone noticed when a car slowed down too long at the curb. Lately, though, Corvin had started asking oddly specific questions. Not accusing questions, just precise. Like why I'd gone outside twice that afternoon, or who I'd waved at through the living room window. That night, during dinner, he glanced at my phone screen every time it lit up. Then he casually asked whether anyone had stopped by while he was at work. The strange part was how quickly he looked away after asking it. Later, while cleaning up, I noticed something small near the bookshelf, a tiny blinking reflection. And the second I stepped closer, I realized it was looking directly at me. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. I froze with the dish towel still in my hand. At first, I honestly thought it might have been some kind of router light reflecting through the glass frame beside it. But when I leaned closer, I could see the tiny black circle tucked between the books and the edge of the shelf. A lens, small, almost invisible. I didn't say anything. Corvin was upstairs showering, and I just stood there in the living room, listening to the water running through the pipes while my stomach slowly tightened. The camera was angled toward the couch, the hallway, and part of the kitchen. Not hidden well enough to disappear completely, but hidden well enough that I probably wouldn't have noticed if the light hadn't caught it. I stepped back carefully, like somehow the thing could hear me breathing. Then I looked around the room differently. At the smoke detector above the TV, at the decorative clock near the dining room, at the shelf by the front door. Suddenly, the house didn't feel arranged anymore. It felt positioned. Everything looked intentional. When Corvin came downstairs 20 minutes later, wearing sweatpants and scrolling through his phone, he acted completely normal. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and smiled at me like he always did. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said too quickly. He studied my face for half a second longer than usual before nodding slowly. That was the part that bothered me most. Not the camera itself, the waiting. Like he was checking whether I'd discovered something. The next morning, he texted me at 9:14 while I was answering emails in my home office. "You home?" A minute later, another message appeared. "Did someone just park outside?" I stared at the screen, confused. The curtains in my office were closed. There was no way he could know that unless he was checking somehow. Then, before I could even respond, a third message came through. "Never mind. Probably nothing." I looked toward the hallway outside my office, and for the first time since we'd moved into that house, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't alone in it. The strange thing was, after I found the camera, Corvin actually seemed calmer. Not happier exactly, just more settled. Like he'd stopped searching for something and was now waiting for it to happen. Over the next few days, I pretended I hadn't noticed anything. I moved through the house normally, answered work calls in my office, folded laundry in the living room, watered the plants near the front window. But once you know a camera is there, every movement starts to feel deliberate. I became aware of tiny things I'd never paid attention to before. How often I checked my phone. How long I stood outside collecting packages. Whether I paused too long when a car drove past. Meanwhile, Corvin kept asking those same careful questions. "What'd you do today? Anybody stop by? You went out around lunch, right?" The questions always sounded casual, but his eyes never did. Then his mother started calling more often. Lenora had always been polite in that cold, measured way that made every compliment sound inspected first. One afternoon, she called while I was making coffee and asked if Corvin was finally feeling more at ease lately. I asked what she meant. There was a pause. Then she laughed softly and said, "Oh, nothing. Men just know when something feels off." That stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. 2 nights later, Corvin told me he'd be working late downtown. Around 9, I went to close the curtains in the front room and noticed headlights sitting halfway down the block. His car, parked with the lights off. I stood there staring through the blinds while my pulse slowly climbed into my throat. He never came to the door, never texted, just sat there for nearly 10 minutes before driving away again.
If he already had cameras inside the house, why sit outside watching in silence instead of coming and asking me directly?
The next morning at breakfast, he asked me if anyone had visited the house around 8:30 the night before. I looked up from my coffee. "No," I said carefully. "Why?" He shrugged and took another bite of toast. "Thought I saw someone." Then he smiled. But later that afternoon, while passing through the hallway, I noticed another tiny reflection near the ceiling corner. And this time, when I looked closer, I realized something worse. The camera wasn't pointed at the front door. It was pointed directly at me. That changed everything. Once I noticed the second camera, I stopped feeling comfortable anywhere in the house. Not scared exactly, observed. There's a difference. I started catching myself listening before entering rooms, almost expecting Corvin to suddenly step out and admit everything. But he never did. He kept acting patient, controlled, like he believed time was on his side. 3 days later, I was carrying laundry upstairs when I caught movement in the reflection of the hallway mirror behind me. A figure. Just for a second. Dark clothing near the kitchen entryway. I turned so fast the laundry basket slipped against my hip. Nobody was there. The house was silent except for the dryer humming downstairs. I stood still, listening. Then I heard a soft creak overhead. Not outside. Inside. Upstairs. My chest tightened. "Hello?" I called out instinctively. No answer. I checked every room one by one. Guest room, bathroom, office, closet. Nothing looked obviously disturbed until I reached the bedroom. One closet door sat barely open. Inside, my jewelry box had been shifted sideways, like someone had picked it up and put it back too quickly. I grabbed my phone and called Corvin immediately, straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, a text came through. "Everything okay?" No missed call acknowledgement, no concern, just those 2 words. The next morning, Lenora showed up unexpectedly, carrying grocery bags like she lived there. "I was nearby," she said, already walking into the kitchen. What bothered me wasn't that she came over. It was how familiar she seemed with everything. A few weeks earlier, I'd reorganized the cabinets while cleaning. Without asking, she opened the exact drawer where I'd moved the coffee filters. Then another. Then another. Perfectly. I watched her quietly from across the counter. "You remembered where everything is pretty fast," I said. She glanced at me for half a second too long before smiling. "Oh, mother's instinct, I guess." But later that afternoon, while putting fresh sheets into the guest room closet, I found a beige scarf shoved behind the pillow basket. Lenora's scarf. The same one she'd worn at Christmas. And the unsettling part wasn't finding it. It was remembering that 2 days earlier, she'd told me she hadn't visited our house in weeks. After finding the scarf, I stopped doubting myself. Until then, I'd kept trying to explain everything away separately. Corvin's questions, the cameras, Lenora somehow knowing where things were, the feeling that objects in the house had been touched when I knew I hadn't moved them. But now the pieces started fitting together in a way I couldn't ignore. Someone had been inside the house, repeatedly. And somehow, Corvin either didn't know or thought the person sneaking in was helping him. That Sunday, the dinner happened exactly the way he'd planned it. My parents arrived first, then Lenora, then Corvin's younger brother and his wife. The entire evening felt too organized, too careful, like everyone had unknowingly walked into a meeting instead of a family dinner. Corvin barely touched his food. He kept checking his phone beside his plate. Lenora looked worse every hour, restless, quiet. She jumped any time Corvin unlocked his screen. Halfway through dessert, Corvin leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "You know," he said casually, "people usually tell on themselves eventually." The room went quiet. I looked at him carefully. "What's that supposed to mean?" He gave a thin smile. "I just think honesty matters, especially in marriage." Nobody spoke after that. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Lenora stared down at her coffee cup so hard I noticed her hand shaking slightly against the saucer. That was the moment I realized this wasn't impulsive. He'd planned this. Every camera, every question, every strange little test. Corvin suddenly stood and picked up his phone. "I think," he said calmly, "we should all watch this." Before anyone could respond, he connected his phone to the television in the living room. Security footage filled the screen. The first clips were ordinary. Me cooking, cleaning, working at my desk. Corvin stood beside the television, watching me instead of the footage, like he was waiting for panic to hit my face. Then a new timestamp appeared on screen. Tuesday, 1:12 p.m. The hallway camera faced the front door. The lock turned slowly. The door opened. Corvin crossed his arms confidently until the person walking into the house stepped fully into frame. His expression changed instantly. The color drained out of his face so fast it looked painful, because standing there on the television screen, holding a key to our house, was his mother. For a few seconds, nobody in the room reacted. The only sound was the television quietly playing the security footage in the background. Lenora stepped inside the house on screen like she'd done it 100 times before. She closed the door carefully behind her, glanced toward the staircase, then walked straight into the kitchen with complete confidence. Corvin didn't move. "Mom," he said softly, almost like he didn't recognize his own voice. Another clip started automatically. Different day, different clothes. Again, Lenora unlocked the front door and entered while I was upstairs working. This time she walked into the living room and began opening drawers. My mother looked over at me in disbelief. "Mabel, did you know about this?" I slowly shook my head. On screen, Lenora moved through the house methodically. Not stealing, searching. Then the footage got worse. Corvin grabbed the remote and rewound the video suddenly, staring harder now. There, near the hallway table, Lenora pulled something from her purse and placed it carefully beside a lamp. A silver lighter. One I had never seen before. Another clip showed her leaving a coffee cup in the sink. Another showed her opening the guest room closet and stuffing her scarf behind the blankets. The room turned completely still. I felt something cold settle in my chest as realization finally clicked into place. None of the signs Corvin had been obsessing over had appeared naturally. Someone had been creating them. Lenora suddenly stood up from the dining table. "Turn it off!" Nobody listened. Her voice cracked harder the second time. "Corvin, please turn that off!" But the footage kept playing. One clip showed her standing directly beneath the hallway camera, speaking quietly towards someone on the phone. "I'm telling you," she whispered. "She's hiding something. You just need proof." Corvin stared at the screen like he'd been hit. Then finally, Lenora broke. Tears poured down her face as she admitted everything in fragments. She never trusted me. She thought I was too independent, too private, too focused on work. When Corvin confessed months earlier that he sometimes worried I was pulling away emotionally, Lenora fed those fears instead of calming them down. She encouraged the cameras, encouraged the suspicion, and when the footage showed nothing, she started planting things herself. "Because something felt wrong," she cried. "I knew eventually I'd be right." The humiliation in that room was unbearable. Not just because Corvin had suspected me, because he'd been willing to put me on trial in front of both our families before even checking whether his accusations made sense. That was the part I couldn't unsee. Corvin finally muted the television and looked at me. I'd never seen someone look so ashamed. But by then, something inside me had already gone quiet. Over the next few weeks, he apologized constantly. He removed every camera himself. He cut contact with Lenora for a while. He cried more than once trying to explain how badly he'd let paranoia take over. But none of it changed the part I couldn't forget. He had trusted hidden cameras and suspicion more than he trusted me. So eventually, I moved out. The last afternoon I spent in that house, I stood in the living room holding the final box from my office. Near the bookshelf, I noticed the tiny camera still mounted behind the frame where I'd first discovered it. I reached up, disconnected it carefully, and dropped it into the trash. Funny thing was, those cameras were supposed to expose betrayal. In the end, they did. Just not mine.
Sometimes people don't start looking for proof because they found something suspicious. They start looking first, then eventually convince themselves they were right all along.